The honourable member for Lambton Kent Middlesex.
Hear, hear.
Speaker, this is a sad and dark time for our great country. The last 2 years have been difficult for everyone. Every single person in this country has been affected by the pandemic. No one has been exempt. How did we get here? What brought us to this point? Standing here in this chamber today to debate the unprecedented use of Canada's Emergencies Act is upsetting, to say the least. The culmination of what has happened to our country under the Liberal government's divisive and stigmatizing leadership is tragic. We've seen peaceful law enforcement resolutions that ended multiple unlawful border blockades without the Emergency Act. So why, Speaker, do we need to escalate to these drastic measures? Speaker, I will always stand up for Canadians' rights to peacefully assemble and lawfully protest. Likewise, I will always condemn disrespectful, hateful, and unlawful conduct. Conservatives have condemned the blocking of critical infrastructure and have called for a peaceful protest. As events evolved, the Prime Minister made no effort to de-escalate the situations. Instead, he escalated it by continuing to divide, wedge, stigmatize, and traumatize Canadians. Instead of apologizing for his mistakes, he threw fuel on the fire and opted for extreme overreach. Canadians have had enough. At the very least, they deserve a plan from the Liberal government to end the mandates. Speaker, it's been said many times this week, the Emergencies Act has never been invoked and should only be used in the most dire situations. It was not invoked for the Oka crisis, not for 9/11, not for the shooting on Parliament Hill, the rail blockades, or even for COVID-19. Where is the threat to our sovereignty and national security? What proof does the government have that the threshold has been met to invoke its use now? The Prime Minister or any of his ministers have not answered these questions. The Prime Minister has said the Act should not be used at first, second, or third choice. But we on the opposition side have asked repeatedly, what then were his first, second, and third choices? And the question has still not been answered. Speaker, the government, which currently has immense powers granted by the Emergencies Act, refuses to be clear or accountable to Parliament. How can they be trusted to show responsibility in answering to Canadians? The situation has become a spectacle around the world, and this is as a result of the Prime Minister's failures. So he tries to save face by using the Emergencies Act, a measure of last resort. It's like using a wrecking ball to fix a broken tractor. It makes no sense. What also doesn't make sense is a February 17th tweet from Foreign Policy Canada, which said, and I quote, "Canada condemns Cuba's harsh sentencing following the July 2021 protests. Canada strongly advocates for freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly free from intimidation. We stand with the people of Cuba and their aspiration for democracy," end quote. Speaker, this is a little rich coming from a government that won't even so much as go out and listen to its own people who have been waiting to be heard. The government claims that they will not use this piece of legislation to take away freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. But we have gotten to a point here where people from all over the country feel that they do not have a voice. We are at a point where the government has dropped a sledgehammer and is taking the most extreme action the government can take to silence the voices of Canadians who are simply asking to be heard. Again, I must ask, what were the first, second, and third things the government did to avoid getting to this place that we are at now? And I'm not alone in wondering why the Liberal government is so hesitant to advocate for the same freedoms for its own citizens as they've asked for Cubans. I know the Prime Minister has said that he admires basic dictatorships. Could it be that they find democratic rights such as free expression and peaceful assembly inconvenient when it doesn't align with their politics? Real leadership involves listening to people and considering their opinions, whether you agree or disagree with them. Real leadership is about making sure people feel heard. The Prime Minister continues to malign and name-call Canadians with whom he disagrees. Speaker, this is not leadership. Real leadership allows people to write your office and say, quote, I appreciate that regardless of someone's perspective on the mandates, you are open-minded and enough to talk to them, end quote. Real leadership is acknowledging and owning your mistakes. It's humility, not hubris. Speaker, if our Prime Minister had at least attempted to listen to the people who came all the way to Ottawa, we would not be in this situation at all. Canadians came to Ottawa from coast to coast to coast. They spent thousands of their hard-earned dollars and time, days of their time, to be here because they felt that their government wasn't listening to them. They felt that the only way they could be heard was by coming to Ottawa. The Prime Minister has done nothing but divide, wedge, stigmatize, and traumatize Canadians for 2 years. Canadians have seen that. Trust has been broken. Conservatives warn Canadians repeatedly about the Liberals' love of power. We have stood against the unprecedented power grabs and scandals since before the pandemic. We said no when they tried to grant themselves unlimited taxing and spending powers without parliamentary oversight. This all happened on a weekend, and Madam Speaker, here we are on a weekend again, debating another piece of emergency legislation that gives the government overreaching power. Speaker, the legislation grants unprecedented powers from Canadians over Canadians' financial security. And I've heard from thousands of residents in Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, most who have never contacted their MP's office. Simply put, they're traumatized. They're gripped with fear that donating to or purchasing from anything not approved by the government will result in their assets being frozen. They have very real concerns of how the changes brought by the Act will impact their finances and their credit ratings long term. They write me saying, quote, my country is falling apart. What do I do? End quote. They are hearing on the news that the Liberals are threatening to freeze their bank account if you support an organization they don't approve of. And that's not exaggerating. During an interview, the Justice Minister even replied in the affirmative when asked if the banks could freeze the accounts of anyone who donated for not liking the government's vaccine mandates. He said, quote, if you are a member of a pro-Trump movement who is donating to this kind of thing, then yes, you ought to be worried, end quote. Well, I would say to the Minister that this is not what we're seeing. It's ordinary Canadians, patriotic Canadians, who are having their accounts frozen. It's Canadians who disagreed with an unnecessary and divisive government policy. It's not people donating large sums of money. It's Canadians who donated $20 or who are being locked out of their bank accounts, those who bought a T-shirt or a toque, and those who sent money to a peaceful demonstration that gave them hope. Speaker, even though the Liberal government says that these financial measures are temporary, regardless of how the vote goes, the Liberals will bring legislation forward to transition these powers into a permanent power grab. They want to permanently remove judges who are the gatekeepers that ensure big government overreach doesn't happen. The Finance Minister said as much during a press conference on Monday, that the move to make crowdfunding platforms reportable to FINTRAC is to be made permanent. She is also telling the banks to review the relationship with anyone involved in the blockades and report findings to the RCMP and CSIS. Speaker, Canadians will look back on this debate in the history books, and they will see which of us and the parties we represent stood up for their interests, for their freedoms, and for ending or enabling the continued trauma brought forward by the Prime Minister's inability to show compassion and leadership, and his power-seeking political games. It is the government's responsibility to stop contributing to the problem, but also to significantly improve its response to address the damage that's already done. Speaker, I would like to encourage everyone to open compassionate eyes, hearts, hands to the burdens our families, neighbours, and communities are bearing, and to create for each other a harbour of safety, respect, and inclusion that we Canadians are known for. Conservatives will continue to stand up for the rights and freedoms of all Canadians. We can do this without the government overreaching and using the Emergencies Act. Canadians are clear when they write our offices to say, quote, I'm asking that you vote for ending all mandates, as well as the state of emergency immediately. It is time to follow the medical science and not political science and do the right thing for the people, end quote. Speaker, that is why I will be voting against this motion.
Here, here.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House.